2010, China already claimed its tariff down from more than 15% to about 9%, and therefore fulfilling all the reduction of tariffs commitment by the WTO. But there are also media reports suggesting recently that after July of this year, 15th, of course, year after China joined WTO, there's going to be huge price drop, import price drop. Is that true?
Oh, I think there's maybe a misunderstanding.
I see.
Yeah, actually in the WTO accession protocol, China made some commitments, a lot of commitments, and actually in 2010, we have fulfilled all our commitments already in the WTO. So in this year, we have no new WTO commitments at all.
I see.
Yes.
That's how it works, right? And Mr. Freeman, you were once an instrumental figure from the U.S. side when China was negotiating the WTO deals. With some reminiscence and also looking at the realities, how has China been over the past 15 years? Or rather, what shall I say, 10 years, because the last 5 years really has already been the period after the implementation.
Well, on balance, it's been a very remarkable run. China has done a very good job at implementing its WTO commitments. Most of the very difficult work was done in the first 5 years, and as the professor just said, really since 2010, much of the work has already been done. The remaining work that had to be done. I think if you're a U.S. government official, or if you're an official from other countries, you focus on the negative. You focus on areas where China perhaps has not met its commitments. But by and large, that's really just the tip of the iceberg, and most of the commitments have been met pretty well.
Professor Gao from Singapore, I'd like to invite your opinion. Is WTO still relevant today after 14 years of negotiation? Doha round still has not concluded with a very satisfying answer. Many are having this question in mind, Professor.
Well, I think the WTO is still relevant. I mean, you might think that the WTO is no longer relevant because of all these regional deals, especially so-called mega regionals, like the TPP and the TTIP and the RCEP, as you just mentioned. But the fact of the matter is, I do not think that any of these countries would like to just stop at the level of regionals. For example, for the US, after they concluded TPP and the TTIP, I think the logical next step would be trying to bring some of these issues to the WTO and have these issues sanctioned in the WTO, because the WTO, at the end of the day, is the only global organization that can make rules for the whole world.
I see. But Mr. Freeman, I should really ask you about this, because Fast Trade Authority has already become a reality for the president. And now it is possibly coming up with the final round of real tough negotiation between the United States and others when it comes to TPP, which is a big multilateral trade mechanism. Is that going to challenge the current status of WTO? How long will that take, do you think, in a way, for it to come into being, Mr. Freeman?
Well, I think TPP certainly, it looks like it will pass in the next few months, and I think that will be a good thing in terms of the momentum.
Why would you say in the next few months, sir?
I think you'll see the final conclusion of the TPP agreement, and then it will go to the respective national bodies for approval. So I can see that happening within the next few months. I don't think it poses a threat to China. I don't think it poses a threat to the WTO. I think it's probably, in the main, it's probably a very good thing in terms of keeping the boat moving forward on liberalized trade.
Really, is it going to keep the boat moving, or actually have the boats entangled against one another? Particularly, you have other ideas also popping up, RCET, for example, FTAAP, for example. These are all abbreviations. It takes us quite a few minutes to explain them in the whole. But these are competing, some suggest, trade mechanisms. Dr. Zhu, what do you make of this?
Yeah, I think the TPP is kind of competing with the WTO for the influence in world trade. But as Charles said, in some sense, the TPP could be helpful to the WTO because the TPP has included a lot of WTO members. They have made commitments, ambitious commitments in the TPP. So then they will be more willing to make commitments in the WTO. So that could help the progress of the Doha round.
But here also comes the geopolitical issue. I mean, we all understand TPP is to a certain extent. Some say it is vis-a-vis RCEP and FTAAP. So how will geopolitics play in a way in the next step of global trade when you see regional and multilateral mechanisms have been becoming increasingly popular, should I say?
Yes, these mega regionals have some geopolitical concerns, especially these major emerging economies like China and India are outside of the TPP. But as Henry said, I think that these mega regionals are not the end, because these emerging economies are outside of these mega regionals.
Right.
So the WTO could be the ultimate platform to utilize these rules in the mega regionals to include these big emerging economies.
Professor Gao, are we seeing a worrying states period of time? You know, in Chinese history, you have so many states in ancient times fighting against one another. Is this one of those in terms of trade mechanisms in the world?
Definitely. Actually, if you look at the history, you can see that before the conclusion of the Uruguay round, which resulted in the creation of the WTO, there were also another wave of the surge of regional agreements. And I think this is a repeat of the scene in the 80s, where there was the formation of the NAFTA, for example, and the EU in the 90s, which helped to push the WTO to come into being, push for the conclusion of the Uruguay round. So I think all these regionals, even though they might seem to be the hottest game in town right now, but at the end of the day, I think in a few years' time, people will still probably go back to the WTO and try to have the WTO to include these new rules because, as I said earlier, the WTO is the only organization which can make rules for everybody.
It seems dust could settle down according to you, but Mr. Freeman, we see one of the things that people asked also about the relevancy of WTO is its capability of handling trade wars and trade conflict. China has been sued, the United States as well, EU as well on different cases. China won certain case, lost certain case, but all of these takes extremely long time, strenuous efforts from all sides participating in the lawsuits. So is WTO really the mechanism for that of conflict resolving?
I think the WTO has proven it's been an extremely effective means of reducing trade disputes. It's an orderly process. It may take some time, but I think most countries realize that by having access to this rules-based system, to having an enforcement mechanism that is fair by any reasonable measure, is extremely useful, both for trade purposes and diplomatic purposes, but also for domestic purposes. Whether you're in China or the United States, you recognize that because there is this external body, you don't have as many access to the tools of trade wars as you otherwise might.
Right. Dr. Chu, though, we see China run into certain cases against the United States, for example, on tire, China won. But when it comes to rare earths, the EU, US, Japan all sued China, China lost. And China is now in this kind of application process in order to comply with what the WTO ruled. But these are very rare cases. Usually we see a very long period of time of judicial process. So can countries really take advantage of WTO as a tool? To what extent can they? To what extent trade can really depends on WTO to resolve the real conflict? Dr. Chu.
Actually, the WTO mechanism is already the most efficient international organization in dealing with conflicts between members. So sometimes we may think that it is too long time, but actually it's very complicated to deal with the case. So I think the most important thing is WTO members are willing to accept the rulings.
I see.
Yeah, then they will adjust their policy to comply with WTO rules. That's the most important.
After all, we only have one global mechanism, that is the WTO for the moment.
Yeah.
Well, we talk about China's entry into the WTO more than 15 years ago. Now let's take a look at what China has achieved since joining the WTO. You see some of the specific numbers. 2010, China overall tariff level already dropped to 15 to 9%. And also this week, Chinese Foreign Minister Mr. Wang Yi also said joining the WTO. Since then, China already signed or is in negotiation of signing free trade deals covering more than 30 countries and regions. Of course, FTA is the big topic. In that regard, Professor Gao, you are really the expert here. FTA is high on the agenda in Asia, but the geopolitical reasons as well as some of the regional conflicts certainly have hindered some of the discussions. At this moment, Professor Gao, is the trade helping us, or actually is the politics hindering us from moving forward on trade?
Well, if you look at all these free trade agreements, I mean, like you rightly pointed out, they are concluded not just for economic reasons, but also for geopolitical reasons. I think now countries are trying to use FTAs to achieve geopolitical purposes, like the TPP, for example. To be frank, I think a large reason for the pursuit of the TPP by the U.S. is trying to make sure that its friends in Asia Pacific are looked after, are taken care of. So I don't think you can really separate the geopolitical concerns from the conclusion of the regional trade agreements.